What Ike Allen and Ande Anderson have created at AVAIYA is what the world needs.
Hello, AVAIYA family. I'm Ande Anderson. My partner, Ike Allen, and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of AVAIYA University. AVAIYA is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Dr. Ingrid Clayton, is with us today to talk about codependency through the lens of complex trauma, fawning for survival. Dr. Ingrid Clayton is an author, a clinical psychologist, and maintains a private practice as a trauma therapist in Los Angeles. Welcome to AVAIYA, Ingrid.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. Why don't we get a little background on you before we dive into the topic today, right? How did you get into what you do today? What is it that you do? Can you share about you?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I can. So I am a clinical psychologist, but I am also a trauma survivor. So a lot of the work that I am doing most recently is really kind of blending my experience and information from the trauma therapy world with what I've lived through, what I'm living through, right? Trauma recovery is always an ongoing experience. And so somewhere along the way, I unconsciously not only went to get 3 degrees and get my PhD and become a clinical psychologist, but I specialized in trauma, not knowing that I had trauma. Because particularly in complex trauma, and complex trauma is repeated exposure to traumatic events and the symptoms of that. So complex trauma is really synonymous with developmental trauma, relational trauma, childhood trauma. So I had specialized in trauma and not knowing that I had trauma because I was so minimizing of my experience. Like, it wasn't that bad, right? Here I am working with trauma survivors. They have real trauma, right? And so eventually I came to start to write my experiences. I was very called to write them down. And it wasn't until I did that for several years that I looked down at the page at my own story from a trauma therapist's perspective. And I was like, I have classic complex PTSD. And so my experience of wrestling with that now has really called me to share that experience with others. Because if I'm a trauma therapist who didn't know I had real trauma, and that was the key to finding true healing, I know I'm not alone, right? So that's why I'm here today, to share about part of that experience anyway, related to the trauma response of fawning.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the background and your vulnerability and authenticity of your own story. And yes, I always like to remind people that one of the reasons we do so many different things on codependency is because it is a big struggle of mine, an ongoing, journey of overcoming. And so I too relate to, the complex PTSD and childhood trauma as it relates to that. And okay, let's dive into trauma and codependency, right? So what is a trauma response specifically, and how does it relate to codependency?
Okay, so trauma responses are the body's instinctual reaction to danger or threat. They are unconscious attempts to keep us safe and create connection. So they're broadly broken down, many people have probably heard, into 4 categories. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So the fawn is the lesser known, which we'll be talking about today. So what happens with trauma responses is that if we find that one works, we can start to over-rely on it to the point where it becomes rigid and fixed, where we almost start to think that we are the trauma response, that it's our personality. And it limits us from utilizing the other healthy aspects of some of the other trauma responses. So really quickly, so the fight response, all of the trauma responses have sort of a healthy or adaptive side to them, and then an unhealthy or maladaptive side. So for the fight response, the healthy adaptive end would be assertiveness, standing up for myself, setting healthy boundaries. The unhealthy side of the fight response is bullying, violence, explosive anger. The flight response is literally fleeing from a situation, running away, or staying in perpetual motion. So this one on the healthy end can just be efficiency. You get things done. In the more rigid maladaptive side, it's obsessive compulsive tendencies. So this is where we see things like addiction, perfectionism, overworking. I don't identify with that one at all, Andy.
I bet.
The freeze response is what we think of as sort of classic dissociation. It's a numbing, it's a hiding. And so the adaptive end would be the ability to find rest or peace. And the maladaptive side would be total avoidance, isolation, major depression. And then there's the fawning response. So fawning tends to happen when fight, flight, and freeze have not worked. And fawning is people pleasing. It is what we think of as classic codependency. It ranges from sort of kindness, helpfulness, compassion, to servitude, full abandonment of yourself, to try to help and take care of another. So we see the fawning response in particularly with children who grow up in abusive homes, with people who have one or more narcissistic parents. And most people have kind of a hybrid of two or even three. So it's not like you just stay in one. So I particularly identify with a flight fawn. Like those are my biggies. I like a freeze every now and then, and fight actually is where I'm needing to grow into more of a healthy expression of my fight response.
Interesting. I too, when you just described those four, that is exactly what I thought when I thought about myself as it relates to like what combo platter of those. Absolutely. The never stop moving, keep moving around kind of person. And that, so I'm glad that you mentioned that it can be a combination, not just one or the other. So you touched on this in the beginning, right? Your story of how you got to where you are today. Can you talk a little bit more about how you relate to this personally, the fawning, anything else you want to share there?
Yes. So once I started writing and I started to realize I'm a trauma survivor, it led me more to a deeper understanding of complex trauma. And I found Pete Walker's work. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
I mean, everybody go to Pete Walker's website. He's the one who coined the term, actually, fawning. And he would say, and I would believe, that it is at the core of codependency. So when I started reading and learning about fawning, it's like it opened up a whole world to me where I started to make sense to myself, because I am also 26 years sober, been in all the 12-step programs. I worked in chemical dependency for a long time. The word did I say chemical dependency? Yes. The word codependency comes from that chemical dependency world. And so, of course, I've known about codependency forever. But in my experience, and I think a lot of other people's experience, that language has become very stigmatized. It's very shaming in a way. And I think it is kind of equated with this idea of like, just set healthier boundaries, Andy. Come on, right? Like, just know your worth. Like, come on. And it feels very shaming and as though it's a choice. So when I saw codependency through the lens of fawning, which again, trauma responses are about survival, which will trump all else. They are instinctual. They are unconscious. They don't ask my opinion. Ingrid, should we go ahead and abandon ourselves for the sake of this relationship right now? They just happen. And I could feel less ashamed about it. I could have self-compassion. And honestly, then I could return to like the wealth of information that has been written and talked about in the codependency world in a way where it was finally accessible to me.
Right. Yeah.
So that was a huge piece of it. And yeah, in case it's not abundantly clear. So fawning essentially is this mirroring of another person's perceived desires or wants in order to diffuse safety. Not diffuse conflict and find safety.
Right.
So in this merging, all of our personal boundaries are sacrificed and surrendered. So there can't be assertiveness, right? It's just this urge to appease, accommodate, and ultimately we just submit. We submit to someone who has harmed us in order to keep us safe. So it's common with complex trauma. It's common with a narcissistic family system. And, you know, the other thing I saw is, so a big part of my story is a lifetime, like decades of finding myself over and over in the same relationship with a different face. And I could not stand this part of my experience. And believe me, I sat on a lot of therapist couches. Like I said, I did the programs. I'm a good student. You know, I am a conscientious, like if you tell me to do something, I'm going to do it. And nothing helped me break this cycle. I mean, talk about shame. It could just make me cry right now. Like I just was like, why can't I have a healthy relationship?
Yeah.
So understanding fawning as safety allowed me to see that if as a child, my sense of safety was found in being exploited, guess what I needed in order to feel safe as an adult? I needed to be exploited.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it made sense. I didn't feel so broken or stupid. I mean, the way that I thought about myself, it was so painful. And I could see personally what I knew intellectually is that codependency and narcissism often go hand in hand for this reason, because both of the unconscious needs are being met, right? The fawner needs to be exploited to feel safe, and the narcissist needs to devour that person in order to have a sense of self at all.